Apostolic tradition.
Welcome. We're here with Dr. Ruben Garrote, who is the associate professor in the Honors College at Florida International University, also teaches religious studies there, and has specialized in lots of different topics within the field, but particularly the occult, which is what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into the topic a little more academically, let's look at your own interaction. I mean, it's an unusual topic. I don't think a lot of kids graduate high school think I want to study the occult as an academic field. Did it, in the very beginning, was it solely an academic pursuit, or did you yourself have some interactions with the occult that made you want to delve into this and see what it's all about?
Yeah, my own experiences began actually in at the end of junior high, beginning of high school, and I was very much partly had to do with the kind of friends that I was interacting with, and there were these stores in Miami that made all of these books, occult books, accessible, and it always had some kind of fascination for me. This idea of a kind of secret knowledge, some kind of occult knowledge. This is very central as we move on to discuss the occult.
The secret knowledge, that's interesting. It's like a gnosis, you know?
Yeah, the gnosis, the gnosis, this kind of, the occult properties of the world, the fact that we somehow misrecognize the world, the true reality of what's happening around us. That's like very attractive. And I think it's especially attractive to people who don't understand the world and in the modern world, a world that is difficult to understand, that doesn't lay out for men, women, a kind of clear path and what are your proper duties, what's your proper responsibilities, when there's a lot of confusion, for example, among the genders or in your role in life. All of these things become very confusing.
Right.
And so the absence of a traditional society, of a traditional understanding of these things, makes you kind of wonder, well, where can I find that? But really, I can say all of that, and all of that is true about me. But really, the thing that tempted me the most, the thing that drew me the most, was this idea of knowledge. It was this idea of like being able to know what others don't know. That's a very attractive thing, and I think it attracts a lot of people to that path. And so, at the end of my junior high school career, I had a number of friends, and we bought ourselves a number of books, mostly centered around a group that arises at the end of the 18th century, around 1888. It's called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Okay,
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, it really is a kind of clearinghouse for everything that comes after, right? The Golden Dawn is where somebody like Aleister Crowley is trained initially, and I'll talk a little bit about Crowley later because he's definitely important.
Figure,
and definitely important to understand. There is like before Crowley and after Crowley, and Crowley really changes the face of of occultism. But anyway, a lot of other big names. W.B. Yeats was the poet, was a member. And
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Okay. It's a very important sort of secret society, paramasonic kind of society. Anyway, but they had been dissolved, or so I thought at the time, and a number of starting with Crowley, a number of their former members or members of their offshoot orders had published all of their documents. And so I and my friends and I put ourselves through the various rituals of that order and so on, and gave ourselves all kinds of grades. And somewhere along the way, I discovered that there were supposed representatives of this order, and I sent out, I tried to contact them, and received various kinds of initiations.
But are they now a 501c3 nonprofit?
Right. Yeah, that's eventually what they become. But anyway, sort of, joined myself to, and this career went on past high school, but joined myself to a number of these orders. A very curious aspect of the people who join orders is that they kind of collect orders. Once you're in one, you're like, well, what about what secret does this one have, right? And what secret does this other one have? And there's always some higher order and some higher secret to aspire to. And at the end, there's there aren't any real secrets.
Now, you weren't raised an Orthodox Christian. You converted to the faith.
That's correct.
And do you think that perhaps if you had known Orthodox Christianity and the depth of wisdom there, that maybe this wouldn't have attracted you as a young man?
I think so. I think, well, number one, what I said before, the tradition is there and the paths are laid out within Orthodoxy, but also Orthodoxy has this fullness of revelation and a way to address even this desire for a deeper knowledge and for a deeper participation with being, with reality itself. Right? It has this ascetical tradition and it has all of this wisdom behind it, which is lacking certainly in the modern West. Right. And I think that would have absolutely been the proper path, right? If I had known it, but so I didn't. So that's the. I took a long way around to get back to Orthodoxy. Yeah.
How far back do you think we can go in history, at least within Christendom, we'll say, within the history of Christianity? How far back can we look in history and say that something like we would recognize as the occult was emerging and maybe existing side by side within Christian communities, that people were drawn to these things?
I think right back to the beginning, to late antiquity, the first couple of centuries of Christianity, you have, first of all, Gnosticism, right? You have all of these different schools that make up this idea of Gnosticism. They're really just a number of different teachers that are, some of them are, the majority of them are Christian, many of them kind of weren't. And they were attractive to people precisely along the same terms that I was talking about before, right? They offered this kind of inner church, a church within the church, and a knowledge of the true reality, right? That transcended the teaching that was given to the outer church, the sort of the material beings, as they referred to them, and only the spiritual ones were able to access these.
That sharp dualism.
Yeah, very sharp dualism. Yeah. This idea of emanationism, this idea that the absolute being, they have many different names for it. The fullness is one, and so on. Kind of emanates from itself, its thoughts, and these thoughts become denser and denser, and sort of at the end of that chain of emanation, this being arises, usually referred to as the demiurge, right? That comes out of Plato, the demiurgos, and he is so far removed from that origin that he says there are no other gods beside me. So they associate this demiurgos with the God of the Bible. And they make the split, kind of Marcionite split, between the God of the Old Testament, who is the demiurge, and the Father that Christ preaches. And this Father is the fullness. And in his mercy, he sort of gave human beings this spark, this divine spark, and through that spark, we're able to find our way back to the origin, to our divine origin, and to fight against all of the powers of the demiurge, which are the powers of the world. Okay. And this usually takes place, knowledge, the idea of knowledge, of gnosis, is central to it. This is a kind of initiatory knowledge, a kind of salvific knowledge. But also, attached to it, all kinds of meditative and ecstatic, ritualistic practices that they undertook. And so, you can trace it back to these early heresies. Saint Epiphanius of Salamis writes a book sometime in the 5th century called the Panarion, the medicine chest. And in his sort of prefatory letter to his fellow priests, he says, be patient with me because I'm going to treat these 80 heresies that are, as it were, like a brood of vipers. So out of that period emerge a host of other sort of brood of vipers. And so you have Hermeticism. It's another.
What is exactly Hermeticism? Because that's a term you hear a lot, but maybe for people who don't hear that very often. Yeah,
originally it's a movement. It's a school of thought, and really it revolves around a number of texts make up what is called the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic body of works, and so on, and other things like the Asclepius, other documents. That are all kind of shaped around this being, this mythological being called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. It's just, Christ-like figure. a kind of representation of the mind, of the logos of the
Was
universe.
he a historical character?
No,
or no? Okay.
no. He's sort of like the Greek Hermes.
Okay.
And the Egyptian god Thoth.
Okay,
And,
so kind of combination of the two.
Right, he's thrice great. So he's the Egyptian god Hermes. Sorry, the Greek god Hermes, the Egyptian god Thoth, and then some kind of guy whose name was Hermes. So like these three, who was some kind of master of this power, and all the documents deal with Hermes, but it's all based around this idea of Hermes, and it's very close to Neoplatonism. The idea of, again, an emanationist system, a system where there is the one, this kind of absolute reality, and between that one and us is something like the nous of the universe, the logos, sometimes referred to. In Hermeticism, is the mind. Platonism, it could be the logos, the nous. And then there's a kind of world soul, and from that soul are all the different souls split out and incarnated and so on. And so all of these three also have this difference of correspondence, right? In the Hermetic tradition, much later than antiquity, you get this saying, "As above, so below." That and that is the teaching that says that we are a kind of microcosm that corresponds with the macrocosm of not only of the universe but of the creator of the universe. Okay. And so if we understand ourselves, we can understand the totality of reality. And so,
so the human becomes an analogy to understand
exactly right.
the numinous.
Yeah,
I guess,
so you can study either, and it leads you to that knowledge, right? Again, ultimately, the goal is always knowledge, but knowledge not as a kind of discursive, practical knowledge, but as a kind of saving knowledge.
Are you familiar with St. Augustine's like Analogia Entis? It seems that there's some similarity there. I mean, that's something that as Orthodox we would criticize that particular paradigm from St. Augustine, but it almost sounds similar to kind of this hermetical
absolutely
approach.
And the chain of being is also there, right? Coming out of Dionysus and so on. But so all of these things are in conversation in late antiquity. I mean, there are definitely these early movements are conversation is a charitable word. They're often in conflict with Christianity and very, very visibly, very vocally, but they're also in conflict among themselves. I mean, within the Gnostic schools, you have very puritanical kind of Gnostic schools, very ascetical kind of Gnostic schools, who are absolutely savaging their so-called religionists for being libertine and antinomian and so on. And there's a back and forth because of the differences in methods and differences in understanding of the symbols that they use. So, I mean, to this, you can add things like natural magic, which has always existed. It's not unique to Christendom.
Is that just based in like using the properties in nature?
That's right.
Like
the
roots
occult, the hidden properties of nature. So
Okay.
like the hidden properties in stone, the hidden properties in plants, the hidden properties in the arrangements of the planets in the sky and so on. And so there's like, hidden forces all throughout nature.
That correspond to what St. Paul criticizes in Colossians when he talks about the elemental principles in Stichia.
I think so.
The same thing.
Yeah, I think so. And then, it's a kind of attempt to exert the will of the magician on nature, through nature. So it's a kind of prefiguring, really, of science. The famous anthropologist Fraser in The Golden Bough talks about this, how the magician is a kind of early scientist, because he just he's dealing with different forces, but he's trying to understand the real forces that run the universe and trying to control them, exert his will on the universe through this kind of Baconian project.
Right.
In order for nature to be mastered, it must be obeyed. Right, we have to learn the rules.
And what were some of the specific early Christian critiques or attacks on these ideas? What did they say was, for example, was behind this? What was its intention? Like, what would they,
Well, if you look at somebody like Saint Epiphanius, that what's behind it is clear, and sort of the theological reality is that it's Satan is behind all of this, right? So that would be the obvious thing. But also, something that is very common is ignorance and foolishness is what they charge these people with, especially with regard to the Gnostics, for example. So Saint Irenaeus, of course, talks, says there is no secret teaching in Christianity. Christianity has the openness of revelation. If you want to know what our teachings are, come to a church and we'll show you the writings. There are no secret no secret filiations, no transmission aside from the transmission of the bishops. If you want to know, here are our bishops, so
Right.
everything is out in the open, and it's a constant kind of appeal to these people. Well, two things with regard to the heresiarchs, to their founders and their leaders, there is a kind of no nonsense attack and calling them fools, calling them benighted, accusing them of trafficking with evil powers and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But for their followers, an appeal to come to the truth that is full and revealed in the scriptures and in the church.
There's an apologetic then, not just an attack on the leaders,
Absolutely,
but actually, trying to bring people into the church.
That's right, and a very careful apologetic. I mean, you have these heresiologists, Saint Irenaeus being one, Saint Epiphanius being another, Hippolytus being another. Who take time, right? The reason that Saint Epiphanius calls his book the Panarion, the medicine box, is because he considers his metaphors that these are like poisonous vipers or kinds of diseases, and what he's providing is the medicine for these diseases,
right? Like an antidote,
and the answer to them. And so he takes each one in detail to task, and provides what he considers to be proper, right, Nicene answers to these different errors.
So, I mean, if we look historically, that time period we're talking about, so we're talking about the 2nd through like the 4th century primarily.
4th, 5th century.
And at some point in Europe, both East and West, the church in its ascendancy sort of becomes the only game in town for the most part, right? Paganism kind of is slowly retreating into the background. Right. What happens to the occult? Where does it coexist alongside? Does it try to infiltrate Christianity? What's going on in the medieval period with the occult? And what kind of develops in that time period?
The infiltration period kind of ends with post Theodosius II, kind of that the destruction of the temples and all that kind of. There's no place for them to be out in the open anymore, and there's the persecution of any non-Nicene Christianity and all of those errors. And so they go underground largely. And there's not so much infiltration as such, but they remain nevertheless underground as temptation for those who, once again, are interested in something that they're not finding somehow, in Christianity.
Do they pretend to be Christians on the surface if most of the people in their community are?
So, for example, Gnosticism goes into, and not only do they pretend to be Christians, but they pretend to be the real Christians. Right? And so Gnosticism evolves into the Paulician texts in the Balkans and into the Bogomils later at the end of and then that, of course, in the West, you go into the Cathars in the north of Italy, south of France, and on the Rhine. These people who reject Catholicism, in the West, reject the Catholic Church and agitate against it, and in fact become very powerful. For example, in the south of France, so powerful that the churches call a crusade against
What century was this, or what time?
This is the 13th, 14th century. Wow. So they call a crusade against the against the south of France. This is where the famous, kill them all, God will sort them out, that saying goes, because they were so integrated into society and into the south of France that the general who is about to sack a town asks the papal legate, how do we tell the faithful from the heretics? And he says, kill them all, God will know his own.
So, I never knew that.
Yeah,
I always thought that was just the lyrics of a heavy metal album.
And then later it's sort of like it's an apocalypse now or something like that. Some of these war movies, but and so anyway, this is the story that comes out. Maybe it's not as historical as we want it to be, but this is the story that comes out of that period. And so it survives into these various parallel churches, parallel movements, but also it survives in the documents. And these documents are rediscovered again and again by scholars. And so you have, by the time you get into the 17th century, you have somebody like Cornelius Agrippa, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, who publishes on the occult philosophy, 3 books on the occult philosophy, that is a kind of synthesis of all of this knowledge that has been carried on since antiquity up until that period. And he kind of puts it all together. And at this time, there are even bishops in the church who are interested in this kind of occult philosophy. It isn't yet
just as an academic thing, or actually think it's true wisdom.
Yeah, they think it's true wisdom. Many of them do, and they because course, at this point, it's not really Gnostic. They're trying to sort of regularize and identify it with the more Orthodox doctrine.
Is this in the Roman Catholic Church? Or at this time, you also have the Protestant reformers are around by this time, right? 17th
the reformers
century.
are arising at this time, and the reformers are not by and large associated with occult. Not at this time. Later, you definitely have some churches that come out of the Reformation that are not necessarily Reformed churches, but that come out of the Reformation that do begin to veer into the occult and things like that. But no, at this time it's mostly within Roman Catholicism, nominal Roman Catholicism. During the Renaissance, you have people like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficcio and people like that, the sort of the humanists who rediscover and translate the Hermetic works. And other things like the Chaldean. Are
you familiar
oracles.
with anything? I know that there were bans in Russia, for example, against Gnostic literature and so forth.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with anything happening in Eastern Europe and in the Orthodox Church at this time?
Not too much about the East. I mean, most of my knowledge is about the West on these.
I'm sure it probably was trying to get a foothold there as well.
Yeah, of course. And the Bogomils are in the Eastern side of the question. So, and for sure they were persecuted. So yeah, absolutely. The Paulician heresy is also in the East, and so I'm not really too familiar with what's happening in the East, but I know in the West, although the idea of occult philosophy was still kind of accepted among certain circles, more clearly what we would call occult nowadays practices were definitely condemned. What you call, what's generally referred to as the grimoire tradition. So this whole tradition of
magic books,
of ritual magic, and this tradition largely is a Greek. It comes out of Greece, the Greek magic and Egyptian magic, and it gets transmitted through the Islamic world into the West.
Okay.
And
so along with Aristotle and Plato, they
along
also
with
got
Aristotle and Plato, you
Gnosticism.
have things like the Picatrix and other grimoires that come out, and then some are native works. But and here you have this idea of the appeal, and you have now the conscription of God Himself and of His angels into this whole system of ritual magic, where the ritual magician protects himself within a circle and attempts to evoke certain spirits, demons, elemental spirits, whatever it might be, into a triangle that is outside of the circle, and binds them by the names of power of God and through His archangels. And sort of you have to go down from God to the archangels to the angels and so on. Right. Go down the orders, making sure that you're recruiting all these people on your side so you're protected, and preferably you're an ordained priest, so you have that protection as well, or pretend to be an ordained priest, somehow. All of these things begin to become eclectic and syncretic in some way.
I know nowadays there's a tendency for people to kind of blur the borders between the occult and say like paganism or neo-paganism. Yeah. So paganism in Europe, for example, maybe in Central, like Germanic paganism or like Norse paganism, did any of that actually survive and get brought into this, or is that like a dead trail and this is completely like the occult is coming from its own tradition, basically?
Yeah, that's largely dead. What we have are nowadays is, the reason why it's called neo-paganism is that these are largely reconstructions from the texts that survive. So as such, the religious practices of these peoples were lost. It's a little bit different in the Balkans. It really, some of those pagan traditions continued up even until the 17th century. But in the West, those traditions were lost and very early on. Iceland converts in 1000. So in the year 1000, they convert, take a vote, and they say, we're going to be a Christian nation. And a couple of generations later, they've done away with all of that. Although some remain, they sort of come to an agreement. Some remain pagan, but after a couple of generations, everyone is Christian. So around that's a good year to cut it off, and there's really nothing after that. If you talk about Celtic tradition, that ends much earlier. Right?
The Druidism.
The Druidism and all that's gone. The Romans basically eradicate that. So it goes back into deep antiquity. But what does survive are folk traditions, that continue to survive, and these things are passed down in the villages, and even sometimes in the cities, you know, and all sorts of little charms that you do, and so little, you know, you steal prayers from mass and you say it at home in a different way, right? The very idea is hocus pocus, as you know, is is a kind of bastardization of the mass. You know, hocus corpus meum. You know, that's that kind of thing. This is my body, and so these kinds of traditions, folk traditions, kind of do survive.
Do they get conflated with the over kind of the other traditions of the occult that are coming in? They get combined.
They do, and especially you find that especially an upsurge of this, or at least a claim to it, in the 20th century, when, as a response to a lot of so there's an anthropologist, really an Egyptologist, called her name is not important, but she writes a number of books talking about the survival of the witch cult. First, of the existence of a witch cult in Europe. There was this kind of unified witch cult, and that they survived until pretty late into modernity. And based on these books, a man called Gerald Gardner founded what is nowadays referred to as Wicca. And in competition with him, though, a number of people arose, a number of other Wiccans arose, claiming that what Gardner had founded was really, you know, fiction, but that they had the real thing, and that they had been initiated into a family tradition that had survived. You know, since,
do you think that there's some truth to that, or another just wild claim?
Yeah, there's, you know, occultism is rife with this kind of claim, right? The appeal to antiquity, the appeal to a secret initiation, the appeal to going east, for example, to finding wisdom. You just find stories again and again and again. So, for example, in this will be like paradigmatic. In the 17th century, a number of documents begin to be published: the Fama Fraternitatis, the Confessio Fraternitatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which basically are the founding documents for what is called Rosicrucianism.
Yes, I've heard of that.
Right. So
actually, my mother was briefly a Rosicrucian when she left.
Like in the
late 50s.
In some of these orders here in the U.S.
In San Francisco, when she went out there to live for a little while.
Yeah. So Rosicrucianism comes out of these documents. People are, you know, there's a lot of back and forth among scholarly circles about as to whether these were serious documents, or whether there was some kind of Protestant prank on the Catholics, or, you know, sort of these things go back and forth. But what's interesting about these, the myth that is told in these documents is a kind of the Fama is sort of the publishing, the making famous, or the making known of the declaration of the Fraternitatis, of this fraternity that exists. And the founder of this fraternity is a man called Christian Rosenkreutz, who goes east and in Egypt and in Arabia and further east, studies all of the ancient wisdom that the West has lost, and comes back and teaches it in secret to a band of brothers. And these brothers are tasked with a number of things, for example, to heal people without charge, a number of rules, but one of them is to pass this wisdom on. Each brother is required to bring in one initiate into this organization. This is paradigmatic for occultism in the West, especially after the 18th and 19th century, which is the rise of these orders, is the beginning again of the institutionalization of the occult in the West. And it's largely a function, really, of modernity. It's very interestingly, modernity casts this very last, you know, the modernity is supposed to be this like rational, right, reason, almost as deified, human reason, deified. But it casts, and so it's the light of reason casts a very long shadow, and that shadow is the shadow of the irrational and the imaginary, and this takes shape into all kinds. It really is where occultism proper, we can speak of occultism proper. Occultism proper takes shape in the 18th and the 19th century, and you have a number of movements that it attaches itself to. Rosicrucianism, you have the return of Hermeticism, the return of alchemy, of Gnosticism. Neo-Gnostic churches are founded in France toward the latter part of the 19th century. Sort of quasi-Gnostic groups like some man called Martinez de Pasquale, who founds an order called the Elucoen, the chosen priests of the universe. And their idea is that they, again, an emanationist philosophy, a Gnostic philosophy, and the idea is that through their rituals, very kind of thaumaturgical order, that through their ritual they will reintegrate the world. The world is, as it were, broken. And they will reintegrate it and unite it back into the kingdom of God and so on.
Where do the Masons fit into this? It sounds similar to something that...
Well, the Masons, as such, aren't really part of the occult. Depends who you ask. The Masons, as such, is not really part of the occult, but they do serve, just as they served in the 18th century as places for the fomenting of, because of the secrecy and all these kinds of things, and the freedom of speech that existed within those secret lodge meetings, as a way to foment revolution. There were also, especially after the revolutionary period ended, places to foment secret occult societies, and so a number of Masonic rites. Okay, so Freemasonry just what's called ancient Freemasonry was not very ancient, but it was called ancient Freemasonry is reduced down to it has three degrees. Okay, 3 ways of advancement: the apprentice, fellowship, and master mason. And master mason is said to be the last degree. But added to this, over time, were a number of higher, quote unquote, higher degrees. And some of these are considered by most Masons regular, that is, they're accepted, but many of them are not. And especially the irregular ones, the ones that are not accepted by most Masons, are very esoteric and very occult. Okay. And so you have Memphis, the Rite of Memphis Mizraim, aspects of the Scottish Rite, for example, because I'm just throwing names out there. But there was one of the disciples of Pasquale, of Martinez's Pasquale, found it was called the rectified Scottish Rite, and so reintroduced into Freemasonry this idea of reintegration and gnosis and things like that. So
even like a term like the Great Architect. I mean, what does that even mean? It's obviously not the same thing as we would think of as the God of the Bible,
Right. So Masons are really kind of the beginning of liberal religion, and Freemasonry, and there are good historical reasons for this. Okay, Freemasonry arises out of the sort of the operative guilds the operative fraternities that existed during the Middle Ages that in the West that traveled from workplace to workplace, and they had their secrets. Their secrets were architectural secrets, how to build things that they protected, like all guilds protected their trade secrets, right? And so they constructed these rituals and these handshakes and different ways of recognizing one another to be able to speak freely about these secrets. And so but over the years, after the Middle Ages, what is called operative Freemasonry began to die out, but these lodges still existed. And so this was the rise of what is called speculative Freemasonry, which is a number of gentlemen who were interested in revolutionary ideas and but also some occult ideas, what was then called natural philosophy or natural science, which was much broader than what we call science nowadays. Began to be admitted into these lodges and using these lodges as ways, as safe places to discuss these things. And one of the rules was that you had to be a believer in a supreme being, some kind of supreme being. But what supreme being that was, nobody was. In fact, you couldn't even discuss it. Nowadays you're not allowed to discuss religion within the lodge. It's conflict. So you can have completely opposite religions, people who don't agree with each other theologically, sitting in the same lodge, both praying to the great grand architect of the universe.
I see.
Yeah.
In the founding of the United States and colonial America, of course, a lot of ink has been spilled on the Salem witch trials, and of course that's a continuation of something that was happening in Europe at the time. Right. And I think historical scholars, particularly the more liberally minded ones, just assume it was all made up to take the land from your neighbor you didn't like, or to get revenge on somebody. Was there any truth that the actual persons, like when the Inquisition began the first kind of trials of witches in Europe, and when that carried over into the Americas, is there any sense or any evidence that we have that they actually were dealing with real occultists in any of these cases?
Yeah, I think that overall, probably not. What they're occultists in the way that we would understand it in this kind of sophisticated melange of different currents, probably not. But they were probably dealing with a lot of poorly educated people who had some of these folk traditions that I talked about before, that practiced them. And Although, to be sure, from the records we know that there are people who were trafficking with evil powers, and that there seemed to be some kind of similarity, and even there's some work been done on this in, for example, in the north of Europe, that there were even so-called good witches and bad witches. That is, that there were gatherings of people especially in rural places in Europe that were guardians of the people. They called themselves they didn't call themselves witches, but they sort of understood themselves as a kind of good witch, as a kind of specialist in spiritual powers, and they, in their imagination and through rituals, tried to counteract evil done by actual witches, by actual people who were congressing with demons and so on. So that definitely existed in Europe, although it wasn't, a witch cult that was all over the place, and it wasn't occultism in the way that we would understand it now. And then also there were people who were taking advantage of all of this and trying to get somebody's land, or
right.
That also happened. Yeah.
What's the name of the famous book? Is it The Hammer of Witches?
The Hammer of Witches. Right.
I've read excerpts of that, and it seems like that itself is almost occultic, like the experiments to do on the witches and how to test for them. It almost seems like that is a type of magic when you read it. It's interesting.
It all becomes very, very, very obscure and occult. Yeah, absolutely. The Maleus Maleficarum becomes the manual for many in this witch hunt. And in some ways, it becomes also the manual for those who then want to recreate witchcraft later. Interestingly, they're sort of like, oh, okay, well, this is what, it's one of the documents that tell us what the witches believed, even though it's really the enemy of the witches who is writing it. And this is one of the documents that is used to flesh out.
It's interesting.
This thing, yeah.
So maybe we can move more towards modernity, more into how, how the occult has continued to develop, like the 18th and 19th century, and kind of maybe you can bring us up towards 20th century and where we're at right now, little by little. Sure.
So like I said at the beginning, I think we've laid the major currents out on the table, and the only thing that we have is like I said at the beginning, these kinds of orders that emerge at the end of the 19th century. There's a man called Eliphas Levi who publishes a very important book in these circles called it's really two books at the beginning. He publishes several others, but they're called Dogma and Practice of High Magic. And that is is the final one before before our, the 20th century is the last kind of synthesis of all of these traditions. And he connects things like astrology, natural magic, or Gnostic teachings, alchemy, brings the tarot in, like the tarot cards, but also brings in, this had already been at work in the West, but also brings in the Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition, which is also emanationist and ecstatic and talismanic, right? It has all of these elements. Indeed, I think that it's largely due to these other sort of Gnostic and Hermetic works that Kabbalah kind of develops.
It's like a Jewish version of the occult.
It is, yeah, it is. At least is my opinion anyway. And so he sort of integrates all of that. And after Levi, you have the foundation of these various orders. Probably the most important one is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is formed in London by a number of high degree Masons who are part of a sort of paramasonic or high degree Masonic order called the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, the Rosicrucian society in England. And these men, one of these men says that he finds a secret document that it's just sort of like he's in a bookstore one day and the secret document lands in his hands, and it's a cipher. It's called a cipher manuscript, and it says to they decipher it, and it gives them a way of contacting a secret order in Germany. And from that order, they receive a number of rituals, and they receive a charter to be able to found an order in England. Like I said before, that order is very important because from that order, it's one of the two most important things that happened during this period. From that order emerge pretty much everything that occultism deals with now. The order is itself kind of synthetic, so all of the things that Eliphas Levi was doing it also does. It brings in all of the tradition, natural magic, Platonism, obscure things like Enochian magic, which was sort of developed by John Dee, the astrologer and spy master for Elizabeth I. That his story is fascinating in its own, but they bring in all of these things, okay, and begin to teach like the rudimentary things about Kabbalah. And out of that, in particular, comes Aleister Crowley. And will come a number of different magicians, different names, important names that will be known in the 20th century. Dion Fortune, Israel Regardie, many different names. But Crowley really is. There was, like I said before, there's before Crowley and after Crowley. Partly because Crowley publishes all of this stuff. He has a magazine that he puts out. Really, they're books. He calls them magazines, but they're really very well produced books that he publishes with his own money as kind of the organ for this new incarnation of the Golden Dawn after the Golden Dawn is broken apart. His own order called the AA. And he publishes, in issue after issue, all of the documents, the secret documents of the Golden Dawn. And others thereafter follow him, saying they just publish everything. And he also...
he was kind of a celebrity in his time,
He
right?
was, yeah. He's sort of the newspapers at the time called him the wickedest man alive.
Did he actually, some people say he referred to himself as the Antichrist. Did he actually do that?
He didn't call himself the Antichrist, but he did call himself the Great Beast, 666.
I think one of the few things I know about him is this demonic commandment. He would say, "Do what thou wilt." Do
what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. It comes out of this received in 1904. He and his wife are in Cairo, and his wife has some visions, and he sort of like whoever his wife is talking to tells him to get things ready because in April, 3 days in succession, he's going to have these revelations, and he receives what he calls the Book of the Law. And the Book of the Law is out of the chapters of the Book of the Law is "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which is And so he calls himself. I mean, one of his magical names is sort of his title as the Magus of the age. In his system, every age has a Magus, a kind of someone who utters the word of the age. The way that the age is going to be conducted is Tomega Therion, the great beast. So yes, absolutely. With Crowley, you can't ever be sure whether he's joking or whether he's serious.
Okay.
He's a great prankster. There's pranks all throughout his books, ways of catching people out. So you never can tell what.
Do you think he was there any sense that he was a bit of a con man as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was trying to use these things.
Many of these men were con men. Yeah, absolutely. I think a sort of con man is to be expected almost in occultism. I mean, the very idea of the foundation of many of these orders. It turned out later, for example, that these cipher manuscripts were not cipher manuscripts. Like they weren't found. Right. There were no secret chiefs informing anyone, and so all of these things sort of were revealed before. And so one of the things that Crowley does for contemporary occultism is that he introduces the notion, and he wouldn't have called it this, but he introduces the notion of self-initiation. That you don't need an order. Okay. Essentially, you can just do it yourself.
Well, that seems to go along with kind of the Enlightenment individualistic program. It's like
absolutely.
It's just like he's
absolutely. And a lot of what are called nowadays solitary practitioners, basically kids like me, or who find a book on in the old days in a bookstore, nowadays I guess Amazon, or maybe a PDF online or whatever it might be, or even on a TikTok video, ways of like initiating yourself into whatever tradition it might be. And so it's wide open. Just anybody can initiate themselves into anything nowadays. And the other thing that he did, which was important, at least for the period, now it's looked at a little bit different, but is that he tried to rationalize or make the occult scientific. He called this system scientific illuminism. And so, for example, there's a very famous essay that he writes early on in his career called The Initiated Interpretation of Ceremonial Magic, in which he identifies demons, the demons that a ceremonial magician evokes, with parts of the brain, with aspects of the brain. And so what you're doing is it's like sort of pre-Freudian. You're dealing with your with your unconscious.
I think the 19th century you had to give everything had something of a scientific gloss to it.
That's right.
There had to be some kind of mechanism connected to it.
And so Jung picks up on this, right? And his archetypes of the collective unconscious, he talks about the gods are really just parts of the unconscious. One of the reasons why we have psychology is because we no longer have religion. Nobody really believes in the gods
Jung was
anymore.
into some pretty weird occult things,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. One of the great disagreements that he has with Freud is that Freud asks him never to deal with the occult, and Jung is like, I know too much to not to deal with it, and that was one of the breaking points between their relationship.
Yeah. So over the 20th century, how have you seen this unfolding? So you have Crowley at the beginning
Crowley's
of the
right
century.
At the beginning, and then it goes sort of underground, but it remains. And so from Crowley onward, you have pretty much affiliation. You really do have this kind of transmission of these orders, or at least of the teachings, in many different ways. Beginning in the 1960s, well, the 60s are the origin of so much. And so let me just go back to make one more point. Another thing that happens in the 19th century, or had already been happening, is the foundation of the Theosophical Society.
Okay.
Colonel Occult and Helena Petrovna Blavatsky found the Theosophical Society and proposed that they have a number of secret teachings that they received from the East. So that's just one example, a very important example, but one example. And so they're also syncretistic and eclectic and so on. But this is one example of something else that is happening at the time, and that is the influx of Eastern philosophies and practices into the West.
Yeah, Madame Blavatsky was baptized Orthodox as a child.
That's right.
And I remember reading, near the end of her life, someone had told her, you can come back to the church. And her response was, they won't let me. And I don't think she was speaking about people.
No, right.
The forces won't let me. It's too late for me, kind of a thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories about the unfortunate endings for all these men and women, who have gone past a certain point, to commit it to sort of like they've agreed to not go. In a sense, agreed to not go back. Like, they won't let me means that you've submitted yourself to their will so wholly that you won't, you're just gonna let yourself be led away. But what happens is that you get then the influx of the practices of yoga, and these things get plugged right into, especially through Crowley. Crowley, in his order, you have to go up two ways. You go up the Western way through all of these things that we've been talking about, but also you have to go through the full Raja Yoga regimen. All of the different, we don't need to go into all that, but all of the different practices that the yogi. So
was this the first time that Far Eastern piece had been kind of put into the equation? Yeah,
it's at this time that all of this gets plugged into the occult tradition, sort of clearly, in an obvious way. One of Crowley's friends and mentors becomes the first. The first person, he goes east and becomes a Buddhist monk, and is the first Theravada monk to bring back Theravada Buddhism into England, for example. Okay. So this is the period. Yeah, a lot of that stuff is going on right at the time, and so and then of course in the 1960s you get another huge influx of this. You have all these gurus coming from India in particular, West, and so again. It had already happened early in the century. You got Yogananda, you have Vivekananda, you have these big teachers who came at the beginning of the 20th century and had started sort of little movements in the West of these kind of Eastern traditions. But really in the 60s is where this stuff just takes off, largely due to celebrities like the Beatles and things like that. And all of this thing that had been brewing underneath really just kind of just bubbles up into the culture.
Is this kind of the birth of what we call the New Age movement?
This is the birth of the New Age movement.
Becomes this massive overlapping of all the different types of occult. And
New Age, things like New Thought. The idea that you can, through your that eventually, it ends up in something like The Secret, right? That famous book. The idea that you can, what you visualize, what you imagine becomes reality. All of these things come out of really that occult world. And they take all kinds of different ways. They take ways, and they morph into new religious movements. They morph into quasi, sort of Christian movements. But really, the important thing is that they spread out in the culture. That whole generation, in one way or another, becomes completely consumed by the occult. So much so that in the coming decades, it's almost impossible to be especially in American culture, but in the West in general, without dealing with some kind of the occult in one way or another. Mm-hmm. There's a scholar of this stuff who has coined the term, or has borrowed the term, but he has coined it in particular for this phenomenon, occulture, the occult, but the culture is occult.
Okay.
Right.
Like general American culture.
Like general American culture.
Culture.
It's just shot through with occult symbols and occult images and occult teachings, and so much so that it's not even so like the orders are still around and all this stuff is still around, but it's not even important anymore because it's just spread out.
How much did like psychedelics have to do with all this? Like, how much did that help spread this in that time period?
Not only did it spread it, I mean, these people were in contact with the early explorers, Leary and so on, were in contact with many of the survivors of the say disciples of Crowley or disciples of the.
So O'Leary was involved in the occult.
He definitely was, yeah. Not at the beginning, of course, but then these things kind of joined together. The earlier generation, like the generation of the 1940s, the Beat generation, like a lot of those writers, a lot of those poets and so on, were very much interested in Eastern traditions, but also in occult traditions. And so if you read their journals and their letters and so on, you see that they're definitely involved in all. And they're rubbing elbows. They're going to parties, and some of these older people from the occult world are kind of they're meeting each other, and they're influencing each other. Yeah.
So I think we grew up in the exact same era. So the 80s with the Satanic Panic. So in your estimation, how much of that was an actual valid reaction? How much of it was just overreaction on the part of like Midwest parents or something like that?
Well, it's okay. So as usual, is like two or more levels to this. But I think on one level it was a kind of overreaction. Not unwarranted, perhaps, because again, it had penetrated into so much. It had penetrated into children's games already, and many of these games and songs, to be sure, the sort of music that was being sung at the time. Not that the people were actual Satanists or anything like that, but they were playing with those imageries. Right? They were playing with images of Satan, and so you saw the inverted star all the time, and they talked about the devil often, and they Ozzy Osbourne has his famous song Mr. Crowley. He sings it Mr. Crowley, but it's one of his famous songs and so on. So it's like it's all over again. It becomes part of the culture. And in one sense, it is a kind of overreaction to this. It's sort of like, but it's understandable because it's everywhere. But and so some things are just sensationalistic things that about animal sacrifices out in the whatever. A lot of stuff was just sensationalist.
I think it did happen though. I knew kids in high school that actually were found to have sacrificed a cat.
Oh, absolutely.
There were the kids who wore the Slayer T-shirts and things like that. They actually did it.
I knew. Or like I said already, I started dealing with this stuff in late junior high, and I had a close friend who made a pact with Satan, and, sold his soul to the devil, and told me about it. During that time, and thereafter I met many who would do these kinds of sacrifices and absolutely would dismember animals and all the rest. Oh no, this would happen, but I think sort of like it wasn't a mass thing that was happening everywhere in the way that it was sensationalized. There were also sort of killings. There were a lot of killings at the time that were associated with satanic, either with songs or teachings or things like that. So there was the very real, right, presence of these things, but also there's a lot of sense, as the press would do, kind of sensationalizing all of this. But here you have, of course, the development. This is like post the development of something like the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, founding it in the 1960s. And by this time, you can find the Satanic Bible and the Satanic Witch and all of his books, and in your local Walden Books. You go to your Walden bookstore, and you're 13 years old, and you pick up.
I remember there were modern grimoires there. I remember
absolutely.
in the Waldens. Yeah.
And this has only gotten, as time goes on, and one way it's sort of become much more watered down. Maybe that's a good thing. But this watering down of all of these traditions has become much more accessible. So it's just like a proliferation of books on the occult, but things like practical witchcraft for the beginner, that kind of thing. It no longer requires rigorous study, rigorous reading of somebody like Crowley, who, to be able to understand them, you have to like speak a little Latin and, know a little Greek and be able to know what the traditions are and what he's alluding to. No, now everything is very basic. It's like, occultism for dummies, and you can just, there might even be a book called Occultism for Dummies for all I know. And already by the, I was saying, by the 1990s, these things are just everywhere in the bookstores. And then now you don't even need to go to the bookstore, because with the internet, you could just get the book from Amazon or whatever, but you don't even need to, because you go to Reddit, you go to TikTok, you get on a Discord server, you get on 4chan, and 4chan, the bulletin board has a thing called X, right, in which people discuss all kinds of things, and you can find all kinds of documents. So there's all kinds of ways of just accessing this. The real hardcore stuff, if you want to, it's just everywhere.
It's accessible.
Just everywhere accessible. Almost parallel to pornography, right? So like immediately accessible, just to everyone at any time. And not coincidentally parallel to pornography, right? But also it's in the music that everybody listens to, right? Sort of coded into the music, coded into the videos. You can go to Netflix and find, just on the front page there, find 5 different shows that are dealing with the occult. Witches of Mayfair, this, Witches of this, the Vampires of that, this.
Yeah, I think that there was a sense, maybe you had the sense too, when we were back in high school and college, that the rational was going to win. Everyone seemed to be moving towards agnosticism and atheism. Yeah. And it seems that didn't happen. It's gone the other direction. It seems that there's been a huge resurgence over the last 20, 30 years of, occultism and belief in the supernatural, and even combining it with kind of false scientific ideas and things like aliens and all sorts of other things. So it seems to be on the rise. Are there certain things happening right now, like certain... because in my experience as a priest, over the last 15 years, I've seen an incredible increase of demonic activity. I'm doing now, dealing with demonic infestations in homes and people who are, I have many more converts directly out of the occult into Orthodox Christianity. What kind of gateways are they finding now? Like, what sort of things are they interacting that are kind of like those gateway drugs, so to speak, into the occult that is causing this and open up these interactions? And why are we having so many more demonic sort of issues, you could say, going on right now?
Yeah, hard to tell, because I'm not in the front lines as you are, but I think part of it has to do with the fact that it's so accessible, and that people who are generally unprepared are able to dive into very deep waters without very little preparation. And also because in some ways, I think the sort of the postmodern turn that society took at the end of the 1980s, the abandonment, as you were saying, the abandonment of reason, of confidence in reason, allows maybe for the surrender to the irrational and to the sub-rational, right? To forces that come through the unconscious mind of the human being, and that people are willing to believe in or trust in, because there is no objective reality to them. That's very dangerous. So okay, my front lines is the classroom, and I always do this sort of unofficial survey at the beginning of class when I have freshmen, and I ask, is it true that is it true that all truth is relative?
Okay.
Pretty much about 98% of the class will raise their hands and say yes. Okay, the belief in the relativity of truth, they don't recognize how self-contradictory that belief is, but which I am at pains to explain to them afterwards, of course. But right, to make this absolute claim about relativity, but I think that's very difficult and to deal with, because the schools don't prepare them. Then don't give them a preparation to at the very least, believing in the supremacy of reason. I mean, at the very least, since the Enlightenment, you had the supremacy of reason. So you could say, well, objectively, this isn't true, or I can fall back to to logic, some kind of higher level thinking, maybe as a kind of immediate protection from the ensnarement of these things. But now there is none. Now everything is up in the air, and so I think that probably that has a lot to do with it. But partly because so many of so much of the media that is consumed is so thoroughly not just occult but demonic, right? I mean, it's just like explicitly demonic media that's being consumed, and it's just being pumped into the houses and into the ears and the eyes of everyone, and that has to have an effect on the soul. Right.
So let's take an example. So let's say motion pictures. There's a lot of things coming out with possessions, and do those things do they act as a gateway, or do they act as a deterrent, like for someone to be afraid of the occult and say, I don't want to mess with that? Or does it seem to draw people towards, like they're fascinated with it?
It seems to draw people toward it, right? An interesting phenomenon, and also it's just like, for example, an interesting phenomenon was during COVID, there was a huge upsurge in online interest in, like, say, witchcraft and occultism, because people were stuck at home and they were on the web and finding all kinds of things, and people, again, plugging themselves into these different currents. But I don't know, some like a movie like Dracula, for example, that has some, has this little scene with the Orthodox sisters who help the Jonathan Harker character. But then pretty much the rest is all this really very occult treatment on what the relationship of the vampire is really this kind of hermetic marriage that takes place between the demon and the goddess, as it were. She's said to be not fully human. She's kind of like, they tell her in an earlier age you would be a priestess of Isis.
I see.
So there's this. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah. And so the screenwriters, they know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, when they incorporate this in. Yeah, that's not just random stuff. That's deliberate.
Who would know about Priestess of Isis? Yeah. I mean, this is very deliberately done, and the culmination, she becomes the savior. So not the Orthodox Church, not the nuns who tell him, stay behind, stay here, you'll be safe here because Christ. And sure enough, he was, right, and that's where he heals from the initial attack of the vampire. But when he goes back home, they first recruit an occultist, and that occultist is the one who tells the girl, the Mina character, although she's something else, you are our savior, you will be our savior. So, and then they're saved through the consummation of the priestess of Isis with this demon from antiquity, and in a sexual union.
I saw one YouTube commentator, I think she's probably evangelical, I'm not sure, but she went through a series of whole movies and showed how a majority of movies, from kids all the way up to for adults, have the sympathy for the devil sort of plot, which she said is, a form of Gnosticism, right? Yeah. This idea, the devil got a bad rap, he has the real wisdom and knowledge. God is the big meanie who wants to, it's a demiurge, right? Yeah, he's the big meanie who wants to like hold you back, and the devil wants you to be free and be fulfilled. Right. And she went through like multiple movies and said, look, here it is again and again and again and again. Yeah.
And you see that, absolutely. You see that in kids shows and in adult shows that are cartoons, so accessible to kids. So there was one, I don't remember, something had hell in its title, and it's literally about,
that animated series.
Yeah,
yes.
Which is for adults. It's not made for kids, but
I've seen previews of it.
Yeah, but it's very accessible to kids, right? And kids see that. It's interesting. And it's about that. It's about how hell really, how the devils really ought to be in heaven, and how the angels are mean and keep them down and all the rest of it.
So you mentioned children's games before. The one that comes to my mind is, of course, the Ouija board. Like, what's your thought on the Ouija board? What's happening there, and how is that? How first of all did something like that become a Milton and Bradley board game? And then how much of an effect has that had on people, kind of as a gateway into other occultic things?
Yeah, I actually don't know how that became a toy, although that's a super interesting question to consider. But it comes out of the whole spiritualist movement that, again, it goes back to the 19th century. It begins with the Fox sisters, table tapping and seances and things like that. The ability to, it's the old divination. It's one aspect of them. It's basically necromancy. It's trying to access the spirits of the dead, and how that becomes a children's game is a fascinating question. I haven't looked into it, but it's something that, I mean, I played it when I was a kid, and we had some very interesting experiences during that. Friends and I. And people certainly have talked about how that has been a gateway for them. But I'm thinking of other things that I enjoyed and continue to enjoy in some ways. Things like Dungeons and Dragons, and which is not by any means a sort of satanic thing, but there are aspects of it that can act as a gateway. So they whet your taste for that kind of thing, right? They introduce the idea of the occult, the idea of magic users, the idea of a plurality of religions that grant powers to their priests and so on.
Right.
The idea of alignments, that the world really has these kind of different alignments, and that in some sense you want the balance is preferable to the good, right? So I'm thinking of games like that. But nowadays, very few people will play the paper and paper, the pen and paper game, but these things are all over video games. Diablo, of course, is one, but there are many. Just about every video game now has some aspect of the occult as well, especially like MMORPGs. The role playing games. There's always some kind of character that is, at least there's a way of accessing very dark storylines within those games.
Right.
And again, the in itself, it's a gateway, because it whets your appetite for that kind of thing. Okay, well, where does this come from? And I want to read a little bit more about this. I want to know a little bit more about that. And then you start trafficking with some real dark things.
So I mean, we can, I think, as as educated men, we could speak to the doctrinal issues of what the occult teaches and so forth. But I think probably something that would be more useful to people would be to hear where the occult leads to. So do you have any cautionary tales? Are you maybe from history, or maybe even some personal accounts of people that have dabbled in the occult and it led down a dark path, and that itself is an example of, you mentioned some of their lives did not end well. Maybe some cautionary tales.
Most of those lives don't end well. So John Dee, like I said, the astrologer and sort of spy master, and mathematician. He was a scientist as well, and so on. His experimentation. So just one example. I'll give you a couple of others. But his experimentation with summoning these angelic, what he thought were angelic powers, but clearly were not. Led to his complete and utter ruin. He began to receive "quote unquote" revelation from these spirits, a whole secret language that they had to decipher, and he did it through the medium. He had a medium, a fellow worker, a man who was probably a con artist, but in any case, to some degree at least, in any case, they received these revelations, and it caused them all kinds of harm, not only in terms of their career and how their lives ended, which ended in disaster, but it ruined their marriage. For example, the spirits said, the future Christian reality will be that marriage, the women will be taken in common, by men, and so they were sort of forced to exchange spouses and so on. And so that was a terrible. And so you have other examples. I mean, Crowley himself ended his life as a heroin addicted, broken down old man in a sort of a kind of retirement home, barely subsisting with the help of some of his disciples, having betrayed many, having abandoned most and been abandoned by most. The women that were his so-called scarlet women, were many of them ended insane or as prostitutes in the streets, just complete wrecks of their lives. And then I have examples of my own life without naming any of these people, but this child, this boy that I told you about, whom I knew, who sold his soul to the devil in of course you can't sell your soul, but anyway, who thought that he could sell his soul to the devil in junior high, really had a terrible end to his own life. And it ended in an early death, but on the way there, it ended his, it culminated in this kind of abandonment of his house and living in abandoned buildings and, writing these things on the wall, ravings on the wall, and just on a bad. So yeah, it can. That doesn't mean that every single occultist ends up that way, though. Many of them are able to negotiate this path very well, and of course, the final end is terrible for all. But God have mercy. But many of them are able to be sort of like competent and have full careers. But I think that the terrible thing is what it does ultimately, what it does to your soul and to your ability to be able to tell good from evil in your own life. To be able to the fact that it allows you to do terrible things to yourself most of all, but also to your loved ones, without considering it necessarily. And in sort of banal kind of ways, even. Not even sort of explicitly demonic ways, but in very banal ways, committing little offenses against your soul and against the souls of those who you love. Yeah.
Have you read Charles Taylor's works on secularism, his Secular Age?
No,
the philosopher. He is it's kind of one of his major works, very long, and he tracks what has happened, the idea of disenchantment, right? What happened from the pre-modern period through the modern period to today. And one of the ways he describes it is that in the ancient world, pretty much universally up through the Middle Ages, we had a concept that we were porous to the spiritual world, right? And the movement in modernity was that we are kind of closed off, encapsulated, non-porous beings. And therefore, making this connection with what you're talking about, the rise of the occult now, I think a lot of people think that they are self-contained. Like they think they are non-porous. They think that it's them making these decisions and not realizing how much they're allowing themselves to be directly influenced or even inhabited by these forces, these spiritual forces. And it's almost as if the ideas of modernity have made it even more dangerous maybe to deal with the occult, because you don't even realize what damage you're doing while you're doing it, that you're not even aware of it.
Like I said, a lot of what the writers were doing, not just occult writers, but somebody, like I said, like I mentioned, Gustav Jung, what they're doing was this kind of rationalization and materialization and scientification of the occult. Sort of like, it's okay, these things are not real after all. They're just parts of what you are. They're sort of symbolic ways of understanding yourself and things. It's that's part of that. That's part of the disenchantment, of the process of disenchantment, is a kind of rationalization of what at one point was seen to be super rational or sub-rational. And so sort of explaining away the supernatural, and yet having access to it in very dangerous ways. So absolutely, the notion of disenchantment had a lot to do with this transition from the 18th century to the 19th and 20th century. But then, like I said, now that even that has been cut off, with the postmodern turn, there's been an abandonment of reason, even that. So, but postmodernism, because it's part of of modernity, it's kind of like the tail end of modernity, is in some ways retains that idea of the bubble. You know, nothing is really real, right?
Okay.
So there are no spiritual realities as such. These are just ways of being in the world, or ways of you know, interpreting the world or whatever. So
I think perhaps the most famous or modern response to this entire movement, New Age, occult period, coming from an Orthodox perspective particularly, was Father Seraphim Rose. So his book, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, in the 70s kind of sounded the alarm, because he's there in Berkeley area, San Francisco area, seeing these things firsthand, developing and coming to the forefront. Would you say that probably a lot of people are drawn to the occult because they're longing for a tradition, and would something, you know, the response that Father Seraphim had, for example, of saying, look, there is a real tradition, you know, there's something really solid and ancient and tangible that provides actual wisdom. Can we you know, make that argument, do you think, to this generation that the Orthodox faith is the solution to this, right? That tradition they're looking for can be found, but be real, and not something that's dangerous that leads into dark places.
Well, it certainly was the case in my situation, and I would I think endorse that. You know, I think I mentioned this before, but part of the problem with modernity is that it divorces you from tradition in that way, as Father Seraphim Rose says. Another once occultist who later abandoned it, and in fact completely turned against it and warned against it, was a French thinker called René Guénon, who's a perennialist. Father Rose was also acquainted with Guénon. And Guénon actually attributes the rise of occultism to precisely that the fact that because in the modern West has been utterly divorced from tradition, and that the religious options that it has have themselves completely denied the traditional, this kind of you know, the proper system of ascetical practices, you know, the pursuit of theosis and these kinds of things, that's not accessible in the West, that people then try to invent traditions, right? The scholars talk about the invention of tradition, especially during this period, but also the pursuit of these spurious traditions to their detriment. As Guénon says, you know, just because you're moving in one direction, you know, just because you're moving doesn't mean you're moving in the right direction. So those who pursue initiation into these traditional movements are actually getting further away from what they're desiring. And of course, what they're desiring has always been there in the church. So yeah, I agree 100%. And the religion of the future does continue to look like the religion of the occult. And the warfare is against that and the true tradition which is found in the Orthodox Church.
So do you have any words of wisdom based on your own journey for those who are struggling with the occult, who are looking for a way out, looking for something different, what they can do to begin breaking free and finding their way to the Lord?
Well, of course, visit a church, speak to a priest. But for me, early on, it was actually the direct intervention by God in my life, and that happened through my reading the Holy Scriptures, and trying to really sympathize with what was going on, not reading it not uncritically, but in the sense of like trying to see have I missed anything here, right? I think that I know everything here, maybe I don't. A little humility goes a long way, and so that for me started the journey back, this humility, and it culminated in prayer, and in a real heartfelt prayer. Just try it. Heartfelt prayer to God to answer your questions. That I think is one thing that I would recommend. Another is delve into the history and see what the fathers themselves had said, because none of this is new. It appeals to itself as this ancient and parallel tradition, But in fact, it's always been the same story. It's always appealed to itself as being, ancient and having some kind of secret that nobody's ever known. But the fact of secrets, there are no secrets. It's not really that, it's never been old. It's never been that ancient. It's always just these kind of speculations and imaginings, wild imaginings of men who were excited by this idea of having some access to superior knowledge.
Yeah, which is really rooted in basic human passions. Absolutely. Greed, lust. Yep. You always find the same things manifesting in their lives. This pursuit of those two passions and power.
Yes.
And so, well, this has been a great talk. So thank you for coming on, and make sure to follow us on YouTube.
Thank you very much.
Apostolic Tradition is an evangelical ministry of Christ the Savior Orthodox Cathedral located in Miami, Florida. You can find the cathedral on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at the links in the description below. If you would like to support the cathedral and this channel financially, please visit us at orthodoxmiami.org/give to make a donation. And if you enjoy this content, please make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Glory to God for all things.